Okay, so we're going to be continuing with the second wave of feminism here. In the last video, we talked about the early 1960s and how the movement began. So now we're going to be getting into the later 1960s and how things begin to sort of ramp up, and we'll start to see different types of feminism within this full second wave of feminist movement. 1965 was definitely a big year, and we'll start to see some of the beginnings of feminism like leaking into other movements and other areas of change. It started with two women named Casey Hayden and Mary King, and they published an article titled "Sex and Caste," with an E on the end, like the caste system, social hierarchy. And what it did was it addressed inequality in other areas of social change. In SDS, which was Students for a Democratic Society, which was like the largest student movement through the late 1960s and into the 70s. When we get into Vietnam, they're going to be like the leading anti-war group. But it also addressed inequality in the civil rights movement, especially in SNCC. They interviewed a lot of women in SNCC and talked about how women in the civil rights movement were seen, were they heard, and really the answer was a lot of times no. That really the best way to be in power and the best way to make change and to say that you're really doing something, a lot of these social movements, is to be an organizer. And there weren't really any women in the civil rights movement given the opportunity to be organizers. So when this article comes out, it causes a lot of self-reflection. Like you would expect people who are, pushing for social change, whether it be student SDS or the civil rights movement groups or any other area of social change, you would expect them to support all disenfranchised people. But we're seeing here that so much of discrimination against women is almost like ingrained into people's subconscious minds that they don't always even know that they're doing it. And so even among those groups, there's plenty of discrimination. So it starts to mobilize women within those groups, and there will even be a group of women within SNCC who will form their own group that was a part of SNCC to help mobilize women in the civil rights movement. That same year, we're going to get two important court cases for women. The first is Griswold v. Connecticut, which we already talked about in Unit 1, which now gave all married couples access to birth control. Single women still do not have access to birth control. If you're thinking USB 1 package gave married people access to birth control, no. USB 1 package, remember, gave doctors the ability to mail information and to mail birth control. So it really gave middle and upper class families access to birth control. But Griswold v. Connecticut now gives all families access to birth control. So going to be a little longer before we get single women the access to birth control that they need. That won't be until 1972, shockingly. The second case you should know is Weeks v. Southern Bell, which struck down a lot of gender-based labor regulations. In this particular case, the Southern Bell Industry, that was the name of the company, they were limiting women's work hours. They wouldn't let women work but so many hours. Even when men were allowed to work, more hours are allowed to work overtime because they said that women needed to be home to take care of their family, so they couldn't work too much. So does that mean that men don't have to take care of their family? Are you saying that men, like children, don't need their father in their life? Or what about single women? Like, are they allowed to work more hours? Still no. Then what's the logic there? So the Supreme Court struck down a lot of those gender-based labor regulations. In 1966, Betty Friedan, if you remember who wrote the Feminine Mystique, she's become now like a voice of the movement. And she was trying to lobby for change in Congress. And a lot of congressmen wouldn't talk to her, wouldn't speak to her, and wouldn't really give her a lot of time. And she recognized that we needed and it wasn't just her, there are plenty of women who recognized that we needed a cohesive and organized group dedicated to lobbying for legislative change at the federal level. And so they form a group sitting in a hotel room, 28 women, including Betty Friedan, who will serve as the first president of the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And so when we see NOW formed, what we're going to see happen is sort of the emergence of like two types of feminism. Of course, there are a million types of feminism, but what we're going to see here in these early years of the second wave is sort of like two categories: radical feminism and liberal feminism. Um, Now is the perfect example of a liberal feminist group. They were working for social change to support women, especially in the workplace. They really wanted to give women an equal footing in terms of economics. That was really something that liberal feminists were working for. So women working for, just general change. Liberal feminism focuses on supporting the gay community, and they also focus on ending violence and sex abuse, sexual harassment, anything like that. Women owning their own bodies, they would support. So, so definitely, even though we call it liberal feminism is definitely the more conservative side. For example, Betty Friedan didn't think that there should be a lot of lesbian activism within now, because she thought that it would freak people out and alienate middle of the road people who they wanted their support. She was like, now's not the time. Now's the time for this. That will have to come later. And so lesbians were kind of like, no, like, what? Now is everyone's time. That doesn't make sense. Like, we're an equal part of this. So a lot of them will have to form their own groups, and some of them felt alienated by the liberal feminist agenda so much that some radical feminists will even go so far as to say, like, that men are the enemy and that women should be apart from men, and that was called lesbian separatism. And definitely the most famous and radical lesbian separatist is this woman that you see here on the right, Valerie Solanas. In 1967, Valerie Solanas published her manifesto called Scum, the Scum Manifesto, or Sisters for Cutting Up Men, or the Society for Cutting Up Men. Now, when she published it, she made it seem like people asked her, like, is this serious? She's like, no, ha ha ha, it's a joke. But it's really not a joke. She was being serious. And we don't think, and I'll get to why we don't think it was a joke in a minute. But basically what she wrote in the book, in the manifesto, and it's online, you can read it. It's honestly hilarious. But what she was writing was that men are responsible for every problem to ever exist in the world. And I mean, whether it be war, famine, poverty, men are responsible. And the only way to restore peace to humanity is to get rid of men. So women need to kill men, and the only men who don't need to be killed can basically are the ones who recognize that they are flawed and can call themselves a turd. And that's literally what she says. She wants them to call themselves a turd, and they can basically be slaves to the female revolution. So obviously this is extremely radical, and people were like, whoa. And I would have to say it probably does some damage to the movement overall, because there's definitely this perception of, like, when that stereotype of a feminist being like a lesbian who doesn't shave her legs and hates men and blah 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 blah. Well, that's basically Valerie Solanas. And so it gives the opposition a lot of room to say, well, look, this is exactly what a feminist is, when they're on the other side is like, every type of woman, every race of woman, every class of woman and man can be a feminist. It doesn't have to be someone like Valerie Solanas. So she definitely makes a lot of waves. And when I said I don't think it's a joke, probably because she tried to kill Andy Warhol. If you don't know who Andy Warhol is, you've been living under a rock. But Andy Warhol, very famous artist of the 20th century. If you've seen those paintings of Marilyn Monroe where, like, every picture is the same picture but they're all in different colors, or like the Campbell's soup cans, those are Andy Warhol. And she actually shot Andy Warhol and went to jail. He didn't die. He ended up dying later. Well, I guess maybe she got the last laugh. He ended up dying years and years later, but of complications they believe from the bullet, because they had to leave it in him. So maybe we can give her the credit for killing him, but the gunshot did not immediately kill him. But she did end up going to jail. Same year that Scum is published, Time magazine puts the pill on the front page. So we're starting to see more and more conversations about this feminist movement making it into society and having ripple effects to touch like every category of person. In 1968, a New York radical feminist group called New York Radical Women decided to start protesting Miss America because they felt like Miss America was the perfect embodiment of women's objectification, that it was a competition turning women against each other solely based on looks. So they held this huge protest at the Miss America pageant in 1968 where they burned their heels, their Playboy magazines, they burned corsets, bras. They even had their own fake crowning ceremony where they crowned a sheep. And it was this whole big thing, which it continued to make news and opened up more conversations about like how society views women and how society treats women. Even if you're not down to burn your bra, do you at least agree that perhaps the Miss America pageant isn't the best thing for women's empowerment? A professor of Boston College that year, Mary Daly, actually also published an article called The Church and the Second Sex, talking about how the Catholic Church has treated women over several years. So now we're seeing feminism begin to bleed into religion. And that's definitely a new category of change. A group of conservative women who wanted to fight for equality in education, economics, and employment, but who were very weary of all of the radical feminist beliefs, they'll form their own group in 1968 called the Women's Equity Action League. So they were not supportive of like abortion rights or birth control or owning your sexuality or anything like that. That's definitely that's like the conservative feminist movement side. They're just working for like education and economics. So now we sort of have this third category of option. Then in the middle would be like now liberal feminists who support abortion rights and support, or some, I guess you could say some abortion rights and support education and economics, but don't necessarily support like complete ownership of your sexuality and aren't really trying to have conversations about sexual harassment and rape culture, and they aren't advocating for gay women. And then the next category, like we talked about, would be radical feminists who support all of it, change in every category. Then finally, in 1969, probably one of the more famous radical feminist groups is founded, called the Red Stockings. The name Red Stockings is actually like a play on the name Blue Stockings, which was an insult for like intelligent and educated women back during like the 19th century. So the Red Stockings founded, and like I said, they're a radical feminist group, so they support every aspect of feminism and all inclusivity for all of the issues. They had one of their more pivotal moments gaining a lot of attention, like I said, in 1969, when they were at some hearings on abortion laws, protesting these anti-abortion law hearings. And because the witnesses called at the hearings on whether or not to legalize abortion were 14 men and a nun, which didn't have anything, none of those people are women who have experienced abortion or the need for abortion or anything like that. So they protested these hearings, and the Red Stockings are probably going to be like one of those, probably the most radical feminist, probably the most well-known radical feminist group that we'll see moving here through the second wave of feminism, and it's a group that still exists today.